One midnight in July 1768, under the hush of the episcopal palace, a sealed packet of letters arrived that would ripple across the Recôncavo like a reed snapping in the wind. The bishop, his candles guttering, his robe a dark smear against the polished table, broke the wax and read. Each line carried a threat not merely to reputation, but to the very order that sugar and rumour had built. The name of a respected family, the suggestion of impropriety that crossed the colour line, the accusation that the domestic world of the Casa Grande had been breached from inside. Whoever wrote those lines had turned private shame into public danger. The packet did not speak in sensationalism. It spoke in the measured ink of complaint and the jagged hand of desperation. It named Mariana de Albuquerque. It named 3 enslaved men. It asked for judgment. If this story speaks to you, subscribe for in-depth historical investigations that dig into the archives and what survives of forgotten lives. Beyond the bishop's candles, the Recôncavo lay broad and heavy, a vast basin of cane and sun where the landscape itself seemed stitched to the rhythm of sugar. Mules dragged loaded carts down rutted lanes. Cutters moved like lines of low flames through the fields. The Engenho São José stood at the center of a small world, whose engine was not a single man, but a constellation of labor, hierarchy, debt, and law. Boilers hissed. The moenda chewed cane with patient brutality. Garapa ran like thin gold under footboards. Wealth here was a gloss on violence. The polished tables of the Casa Grande fed by the steady drudgery of the Kenzala. Honor was currency in that world. Nobility was not merely inherited, it was performed every hour in dress, in posture, in small humiliations suffered by the enslaved, and in the public ceremonies that declared supremacy. The church, the Captain Moor, the magistrates, the sale ledgers, and the gossip all conspired to keep the veneer intact. When that veneer cracked, when blood, childbirth, or rumour threatened it, the response was theatrical and severe. The goal was not simply to punish, it was to restore a visible certainty, a social order that made sense. Engenho São José looked like many others, yet lived as a microcosm of those contradictions. Its owner family possessed land and a name, social alliances that reached into Salvador and across the water to Lisbon. The Casa Grande was a house of many rooms, cool and honeyed under thick tiles, where fans moved like slow birds and where the wife of the Captain Moor moved like a fragile, gilded thing. The Kenzala was a world below, packed with voices, craft, memory, circulated foods and hushed resistances. Between those tiers moved the servants with their trades, carpenters, healers, literate pages, midwives, people whose skills rendered them indispensable and, at the same time, vulnerable. At the heart of the story was Mariana de Albuquerque. She was a woman of her class, educated in the limited way the colony allowed, taught the duties of patrician femininity, prepared for a marriage that would consolidate fortunes and status. Her marriage to João Rodrigues Coelho, the Captain Moor, had been an arrangement of strategy and alliance. He was a man of standing, stern, commanding, reputed in the region for both military skill and an inflexible will. Where João Rodrigues was public order, Mariana's life became enclosure. Inside the Casa Grande, she read. Books, when she could procure them, offered windows no plantation stair could bar. She read romances illicitly smuggled or passed hand to hand, stories that tended to the private centers of desire and imagination, denied by marriage and motherhood alike. The estate afforded her servants by the score. It did not afford her intimates who shared thought or tenderness as equals. She was a figure both sheltered and watched. The matriarchal eyes of Donna Beatrice, the expectations of kin, the vigilant servants who monitored comings and goings as extensions of property. João Rodrigues's violences were not secrets. He exercised his authority with a public hardness and private impunity. Within the law of the colony, his body and his will were extensions of the patriarchal order. Within the home, his decisions held domestic weight that few dared to question. When accounts spoke of his mastery, they also hinted at a latent brutality, at uses of power that included the sexual use of those over whom he commanded, practices that history names plainly as sexual violence. Those violences were part of an architecture of domination that positioned Mariana paradoxically, legally protected by marriage and social status, yet physically and emotionally confined. Into that tense interior moved three men whose lives intersected with Mariana's days in ways that would complicate the tidy categories of ownership and intimacy. Each man carried a skill that made him necessary to San Jose, and through that necessity, he was granted a proximity dangerous to the social order. Damião, whose hands knew wood the way lungs knew air, was the Engenho's carpenter. He came from a place indefinido. Records do not preserve his first years, but his work announced him. He could fashion a shutter that would brave storms and shadow, repair a chair as if mending a joint in a human body, whittle toys into being with the economy of motion, a maker a cruise. The Casa Grande relied on him for the small fixes that kept its routine unmarred. His labor was invisible until it ceased to function. Damião had learned crafts that allowed him small freedoms. He could barter a repaired table for extra cassava. His tools were a language of negotiation. He spoke little of himself, but his gestures held an inner steadiness. When a shutter broke, it was often Damião who climbed the ladder and bent his body close to the house, moving through spaces the Captain Moore and his wife left unexamined. João Benguela was a different kind of man, a healer and a warrior in miniature. He carried memory in the curves of his hands, the rhythmic songs of people whose names had been stripped, but whose techniques and gestures survived in the plants they brewed and the ways they bound wounds. His knowledge of roots and teas, of poultices and the lateral alignments of bones gave him an authority recognized in a pragmatic way by both enslaved and free. He had been in places where violence hardened a body and where healing was both practical and spiritual. People whispered he had been a soldier in a different life, or that his past coursed with the memory of martial prowess. The nickname Benguela suggested originary connections across the Atlantic. Such labels were partial and assigned by others, but they pointed to networks of identity and resistance. He moved through the house and the fields, carrying the capacity to save and to resist, for a wound healed could, in time, be a wound reopened. Miguel was striking for reasons other than hands or herbs. He was a mulatto page, literate in a colony where reading among the enslaved could be rare and dangerous. Miguel's education was the product of proximity and perhaps the partial toleration of Dona Beatriz or some leniency within the house. He read aloud in the evenings, his voice quiet and precise, bringing news from Salvador or passages from a book that taught manners and piety. Literacy gave him a shadow of agency. It allowed him to transcribe purchases, to act as intermediary, to sign with a practiced hand when others could not. Miguel's letters would later be evidence of a different kind, things that could be read against him and against those he knew. He was, in the eyes of law, property. In the eyes of the Casa Grande, a convenient instrument. In the shadows, a man who recognized the power of ink. The early encounters that knit these lives together were small events with major consequences. Incidents in which the impossibility of consent under ownership met the human habits of care, necessity, and curiosity. A shutter broke. It was a simple failing of timber, weathered, swollen, the sort of domestic fracture that demanded a skilled hand. João Rodrigues would have had it fixed by a hired carpenter, had he cared to look. Instead, the work fell to Damião. Mariana, who spent long afternoons at the windows with a book or a folded letter, had complained of drafts. She watched from behind gauze curtains as Damião climbed and worked. The scene that followed has been described in later depositions and reconstructed from memory. The precise interiority of either figure is uncertain, indefinido, though the outward facts hold. Damião's presence at the shutter was practical. He not only repaired wood, he cleaned the frame, shored it against rot, smoothed it so that it shuttered silently at dusk. In the lit closeness of his labor, the two found a margin of conversation. A loaned word about a passage in a book, a careful question about a household item, the sharing of a meal salvaged from the kitchen. The power dynamics were clear. Damião could not refuse a request from his mistress without risking punishment, but small interactions gathered meaning. When hands touched a plank near a handrail, when a voice lowered, the possibility of intimacy was not necessarily mutual in the modern sense. It was the product of proximity and imbalance, an unavoidable byproduct of the structure the plantation enforced. Yet those small acts, looking, sharing, handing over a small repair tool, began to weave a private history. João Benguela came into the Casa Grande in the wake of wounds. A laborer had been cut in the fields, an infection threatened. It was Benguela who brewed the teas, who applied compresses steeped in words as much as in herbs. The duties of the healer were scientifically practical and culturally resonant, a blending of bodies and songs, of slow stirring, and the long patience of touch. He would sit with Mariana in the high hours when the household slept, cupping leaves between his fingers, explaining how a poultice worked, whispering charms that were not wholly within the sanctioned lexicon of Catholic ritual. Their conversations were threaded with the politics of care. He taught her about the plants that could staunch bleeding. She told him about a passage she found troubling in a romance, small transgressions that acknowledged the limitations of their worlds. In those exchanges, a different intimacy formed, one shaped by knowledge and competence, not merely spectacle. Miguel's contributions were quieter but no less charged. His literacy made him a conduit of language and ideas. When pages in a book were difficult, he would read them aloud as Mariana sat with a candle. When letters arrived from Salvador, he translated their formalities. The two shared a hunger for the larger world. Miguel's eyes lingered on descriptions of ships and distant ports, Mariana's on the rhetorical flourishes of foreign poets and the oddities of Lisbon court life. Their companionship was intellectual as much as it was emotional. A meeting of two contained people who found in the precariousness of privacy a measure of recognition. These beginnings were not romance in any modern egalitarian sense. They were acts situated inside a matrix of force, obligation, and survival. The enslaved men navigated choices that were often coercive. Their gestures of care might have been sincere, tactical, or a mixture of both. The law offered them little recourse. To refuse could be to invite violence. Yet nor the cruelty of the system, nor the obvious limits of consent, erase the moments of human tenderness that threaded through the Casa Grande. To reconstruct those moments is to hold two truths together: the existence of warm exchanges and the presence of structural violence that framed them. Rumors gathered around such exchanges with terrible speed. Servants have always been the colony's informal news network. Whispers gathered in the kitchen, in the courtyard, in the long afternoons by the well. But more than idle gossip, there were pragmatic fears at play. Rumors could destabilize alliances, invite punishment from the Captain Moor, jeopardize the economic calculations of family members who relied on appearances to maintain credit and marriage prospects. In a society where a woman's alleged dishonor could be read as a stain on a lineage, rumor operated as a weapon as much as a hygienic form of social policing. It did not take long for a rupture to occur. Teresa, herself enslaved and burdened with a child whose future remained bleak, found leverage where others saw only shame. She approached Mariana with a demand: money, food, maybe the promise of freedom for her son. Histories vary and the precise terms are indefinido. In some accounts she was motivated by desperation, in others by a strategic reading of the opportunity a threatened household offered. The act of blackmail, naming the price at which silence could be bought, was both an assertion of agency and a grim reflection of the options available to the enslaved. Denied formal channels of redress, some turned to the dangerous arithmetic of negotiation. For Mariana, the encounter with Teresa posed a new kind of threat. A woman of her class might have dismissed such a claim and punished Teresa for it. But in a world where whispers could become warrants, and where family honor was invested in the eradication of taint, the risk was material. Mariana paid, or at least appears to have negotiated. Again, the exact accounting is indefinido, because silence could be procured at a price less ruinous than public scandal. Payment did not buy peace. It purchased perhaps a temporary suppression of rumor. It did not erase the accumulation of small acts that might later be seen as evidence. Damiana, the Chenzala's trusted midwife, watched these exchanges with a different anxiety. Midwives hold the intimate records of bodies. They also interpret signs that others cannot read. Damiana had delivered children, whispered to women in labor, and understood how the body tells truth. Her conscience was slow to fracture, but when a pregnancy inside the Casa Grande emerged, one that could not be penned down with a simple lie, she faced an impossible choice. To speak was to endanger those she cared for. To remain silent was to participate in the concealment of a social crime. It was Damiana who finally confirmed, in hushed words to someone who would later testify at the ecclesiastical tribunal, that Mariana was with child. The news moved like a splinter under the nail, an irritation, a wound, impossible to ignore. That a woman of status would carry the seed of a child not fathered by her husband was a scandal in any era. In São José, it was an existential crisis. The pregnancy crystallized hidden acts into a visible marker. It transformed private whispers into a problem for the local magistrates and, crucially, for the Church, whose concern for honor and moral discipline intersected with the patriarchal imperatives of the family. Once evidence of pregnancy moved beyond the kitchen, strategic decisions accelerated. The household could attempt to hide what could be hidden, send the woman away under pretexts of health, conceal the child, or concoct a plausible story of paternity. But the political networks that held the family's status together were not indifferent to the risk. Relatives in Salvador fretted about alliances. Creditors considered whether the scandal might make repayment difficult. The Captain-Mor, publicly untroubled, privately intensified his control. He moved with the calculus of a man whose primary medium was coercion and whose response to potential dishonor was suppression. This is where letters, those fragile carriers of accusation, acquired their lethal force. The sealed packet that found its way to the bishop's table contained names and intimations and, perhaps, threats. Who drafted those letters is partially clear in surviving testimony and partially indefinido. Some narratives point to Teresa, the woman who had tried to commodify silence. Others point to resentments that ran deeper and were born by kin who feared ruin. The process of gathering signatures, of pressing wax, of assuring that a missive crossed the distance to Salvador, required coordination and courage. Once in the hands of the bishop, the letters could be framed as a plea for moral adjudication rather than mere gossip. The Church, anxious to uphold the social order it both derived power from and helped to police, treated such complaints as matters for ecclesiastical inquiry. Honor and order were inseparable in the colonized space. A stain on chastity was a stain on community. The bishop acted not simply as a spiritual arbiter, but as a political actor whose verdicts carried economic and social weight. An ecclesiastical tribunal could deliver secrecy or spectacle, absolution or punishment. It could also produce documents that would later be arranged as a public record of moral rectitude. Yet the paradox of colonial jurisprudence was brutal and evident. A system that legally defined enslaved people as property, yet charged them with individual moral culpability when the social order needed an example. The tribunal that convened to adjudicate the complaint would operate under this contradiction. The men who were accused, Damião, Ruambenguela, Miguel, would be treated in the courtroom as both agents of sin and as objects whose lives and bodies belong to others. The notion of consent in such a world loses its modern shape. The law could punish the enslaved for seduction even as it recognized their lack of legal autonomy. This logical contortion enabled the elite to frame punishment as justice while preserving property relations. It required that enslaved persons be both guilty individuals and owned things. In the ways disputes unfolded, procedures blurred the lines between confession, coercion, and evidence. Interrogations recorded in the tribunal's fragmentary notes, surviving papers that scholars have since pieced together, show men who were questioned under duress, who sometimes refused Catholic rites, who sometimes invoked ancestral languages in moments of prayer. Miguel, the literate page, wrote a letter that would be later catalogued among the documents. The existence of that letter would become a key fragment in the archive. For others, words were torn from them under the weight of a legal apparatus built to secure public pedagogy. Make an example and the rest will fear. The disruption that followed was both immediate and theatrical. The Captain-Mor, the family, and the local notables prepared for a spectacle that would reassert hierarchy. In Salvador, the ecclesiastical court's slow machinery could, when it wished, move decisively. The men were removed from São José, their bodies transferred across space to the Aljube prison. Their hands were bound not only by ropes, but by the expectation of a dramatic end that would teach the colony what it meant to transgress a line. What would happen to Mariana herself remained, at first, a problem for private negotiation. Exile to a convent, the destruction of notes that might compromise others, the sale of property, soft-sounding remedies with hard consequences, became possibilities on the table. The family that had once relied on the sugar's steady flow now faced the fracturing of credit, the erosion of alliances, and the capacity for reputation to translate into capital. The public spectacle the court would stage was as much about restoring fiscal faith as moral order, but the process of exposure produced countercurrents. Where the elite intended secrecy, memory had already assembled artifacts resistant to erasure. A page saved under a mattress, a half-burned note rescued by a servant, the hard memory of those who could not be silenced. Such fragments would later serve as testimony that the official narrative could not fully contain. They were small resistances, letters, songs, the dried mark of a poultice, objects that carried a different truth than the one the tribunal sought to inscribe. As summer gave way to a harsher season, the engine of San Jose began to cough. Creditors in Salvador called in favors. Negotiations grew tense around the sale of land and the dispersal of enslaved labor. The Captain Moore, who had once reigned with public certainties, found his authority mitigated by legal procedures and social anxieties. The Casa Grande seemed suddenly brittle, its paneling thin under the pressure of rumor and law. At the same time, the three men's daily lives shifted from the measured economy of craft and care to the grinding movement of custody, the removal, the confinement, the transport. For Damião, the tools that had once ratified his skill lay idle. For Benguela, the plants he had once gathered lay in a chest that bore others' signatures. For Miguel, literacy became an instrument against him. The transition from worker to accused was not merely a change in status, but a transformation of being under law. Their bodies were now legible in public record as signs to be read, judged, and performed for the colony's moral instruction. Surviving fragment, reconstructed. When they took me, the house smelled of cassava and old lilacs. I tried to fold my hand to the priest. I found no words in his book for what I felt. They asked me where my faith lay. I told them the song my mother told me when she was afraid. They wrote a different thing. The fragment is not a verbatim transcript of any preserved confession. Its lines are pieced from later references and the tonal echoes found in the pages that remain. Yet it hints at a continuity of interior life that official archive rarely captures, a mixture of fear, invocation, and the persistence of a voice that refuses the neat categories inscribed by the court. The bishop's reply, if we can call it that, was careful. The church could not ignore requests for intervention without signaling leniency toward the erosion of moral codes. Neither could it appear capriciously cruel in a colony whose social fabric required delicate tending. Decisions were shaped by the needs of alliance, to maintain creditors' confidence, to reassure other families, to display firmness in the face of an alleged breach. The tribunal that would follow was therefore less a neutral inquest than a performance of judicial theology, an enactment intended to place the disorder back into visible equilibrium. As inquiries advanced, more fragments emerged. A page torn from a pocket and later catalogued among evidence, misplaced, then preserved, suggested Miguel had drafted a short letter to Mariana before his arrest. Scholars have reproduced it as a surviving note reconstructed, and treat its contents as an intimate glimpse rather than proof. The reconstructed letter reads like a small bridge between two people trying to map a dangerous affection. Surviving note, reconstructed. Lady, the sounds you like are from the sea and the reed. I have learned to make the letters you ask of me. If time allows, I will leave a line in the coffee jar where the black cup hides. Do not hurt yourself for me. If the world is sharp, remember the name my mother sang. Here again the exact phrasing is indefinido. What survives is the outline, an offering of attention, a small practice of care, a sign that literacy had become a means of intimate exchange. The move from private shame to public accusation was not inevitable. It was contingent on choices made by multiple actors, by the desperate cunning of Teresa, the conscience of Damiana, the calculation of kin, the bishop's appetite for control. Each decision was freighted with the knowledge that outcomes would be unequal, for the family, ruin, For the enslaved men, a litany of bodily consequences. For Mariana, exile and the erasure of writings. The scandal had become a mechanism to sort social pain into legible categories: guilt, punishment, lesson. And yet, even as the machinery of exposure warmed, the acts that precipitated it were not erased. They persisted as lived memories, as fragments tucked into drawers, as the quiet collection of names by those who would later resist the official version. In these small objects and testimonies lay a different archive. Not the legal narrative that sought to teach the populace what order meant, but the lived testimony of people who moved through systems of constraint and carved in the margins a contradictory history of care, coercion, and survival. The story that began at the bishop's table would, from this point, accelerate toward a theatre of judgment. But before the first gavel dropped, before the procession mounted for Salvador, the seeds had been sown, a household unraveling, an engine of sugar stuttering, a trio of men whose skills and proximity had marked them for blame, and a woman whose life, shaped by the limited freedoms of her position, became the flashpoint for a colony's anxieties. The next steps would be the slow, somber apparatus of law and the fast, bitter economy of rumor. Arrests, interrogations, confessions shaped by fear, and the mechanics of a tribunal that wanted to show it could render in public the proper price for transgression. It would demand names and signatures, tear rooms apart for letters, and call on the church to reassert its moral authority. For some, the outcome would be death. For others, exile or the sale of lands. For still others, the erasure of words that had once dared to claim feeling. But those acts, however decisive, would not entirely remove what had happened. Fragments would survive, hidden and stubborn, ready for later hands to find. The Casa Grande's doors closed for a while as decisions moved towards Salvador. Within the Chenzala, talk became softer, more guarded. Damien's tools lay unused in a shed where dust had already begun to gather. Benguela collected his herbs one last time and left them where no one thought to look. Miguel kept an ink-stained scrap folded in the seam of his shirt, a small defiance against the world that would soon read him as a mere thing. Mariana, for her part, tore pages from a notebook and hid them beneath the floorboards, words that would later be partly destroyed and partly recovered. The letters that had been sent to the bishop had done their work. Secrets had crossed into an institutional channel that could transform accusation into authority. But the passage from scandal to spectacle required a stage. Salvador, with its plazas and its magistrates, had that stage. The tribunal's forms, the inked transcripts, the ritualized procedures, would soon assemble to instruct the colony about the boundaries of permissible conduct. That ritual, however, would have to contend with the harder problem that underlay everything. The contradiction between a law that claimed enslaved people had the moral capacity to seduce and the same law that persisted in treating them as property without personal autonomy. Histories of the Recôncavo habitually note this paradox in abstract terms. Here it would be lived and messy, and it would put on public display the hypocrisy at the heart of elite power. Those who professed to protect honor had often been the ones most given to violating it. The scandal's exposure did not create hypocrisy, it merely unmasked it for a season. What followed next would be the removal of the accused to Salvador, the convening of the ecclesiastical tribunal under the watchful eye of Bishop Dom Fray Manuel de Santa Inés, and the slow construction of confessions under pressure. The men would be forced to navigate the space between death and confession while the family prepared its defense. The engines of fashion, of rural credit, of marriage contracts would all be pressed into the service of a public punishment designed to calm anxieties, and in that measure to preserve an order that preferred spectacle to truth. But before the tribunal's doors opened, before the city's square filled with people who wanted to watch an example made, there lay a small, stubborn tangle. Those fragments hidden beneath boards and in the seams of shirts, the half-burned notes that would not entirely succumb to flame. They were residues of what had been attempted to be erased. They would later be the raw material historians gathered to reconstruct what had been lived and to ask the difficult questions about how systems of power use law and ritual to reassert themselves. For now, the Casa Grande seemed a suspended thing. A house that had once hummed with the routines of authority and consumption had become a stage for nerves. The Muenda kept turning at the edge of perception. sugar would be produced. Men and women who had been part of the scandal continued to move through the colony's life, altered by fear and memory. In this interval, before the public machinery ground into its full performance, small acts of tenderness and negotiation continued in whispers. Surviving fragment, reconstructed. If they call the priest, tell him I said I forgive. If they ask about the shutters, say it was the wind. If they ask about the letters, burn them twice. For the rest, for those who could not keep their mouths, let them say the things they must. I am not what they will make me. That fragment, if fragment it can be called, suggests a voice trying to anticipate a disposal. The destruction of words to protect others, the acceptance of a fate shaped by forces beyond personal agency. Whether Mariana wrote those lines, or whether they are an accumulation of accounts stitched together later, is partially indefinido. What is clear is that as letters moved and rumors solidified into charges, choices multiplied and the circle of culpability widened. The first part of the story had carried the household from casual intimacy to imminent exposure. It had shown how skills and proximity produced dangerous closeness, how desperation and conscience could transform private matters into public ones, how the church and law could both claim authority and harbor hypocrisy, and how fragments, hardened pieces of memory, refused total erasure. What came next would test everyone involved, the men who were accused, the woman at the center of the scandal, the family that feared ruin, and the institutions that sought to instruct a colony on the acceptable contours of behavior. The tribunal in Salvador would not be merely judicial, it would be theatrical and deeply political, a scene where justice and spectacle braided together to produce an example. The decisions made there would result in the dislocation of people, the sale of estates, a woman's exile, and the execution of those who had crossed an impossible line. Even now, beneath the Casa Grande's polished veneer, the Chenzala hummed with quieter histories that would later be extracted through patient archival work. Names, once uttered only in fear, would be found in court ledgers, in half-burned notes, in the hands of a midwife who later recalled a single definitive sign. The record that remained, uneven, fragmentary, and too often shaped by those with power over the pen, would leave historians with tasks of reconstruction and caution. But the question that haunted the colony was simple and terrible. How does a society punish a crime that its own basic laws both enable and deny? That question would not be answered neatly in a single tribunal. It would echo through the executions, through the exile, through the economic collapse of São José, and through the quiet survival of fragments that later hands would read as testimony. At the moment the bishop folded the letters, the wax still warm under his thumb, the parish bells in Salvador had not yet begun to toll for the spectacle to come. Yet the die had been cast. A private intimacy, shaped by the cruelty of an order that permitted it, had become a public catastrophe. The next days would be the slow, implacable turning of legal wheels. The cogs would creak with judgments, with confessions, with the performance of righteousness. The Casa Grande had already become a question mark in the landscape of the Recôncavo, and the answers would not be tidy. The journey from the Casa Grande to Salvador was not merely a change of address, it was a translation from a private crisis into a civic performance. Carriages creaked over the red clay roads, the mules' bells clanged, and the three men, taken one by one, were folded into the colony's punitive geography. The Aljube prison's stone mouth swallowed them. The household's belongings were inventoried. The captain-more walked through rooms that suddenly seemed staged, his gait measured as if each step might be read by creditors and cousins. The letters that had set these motions in place were already climbing other ladders of power. Copied, annotated, quoted in salons and in the margins of ledgers. What had been whispered in the Chenzala had become a dossier. Salvador waited with its plazas and its tribunal rituals. The bishop, Dom Fray Manuel de Santa Ines, convened a mixed court that combined ecclesiastical concern with civic order. The tribunal's interest was not limited to private morality. To the men who administered law, a scandal of this scale threatened social taxonomies, lineage, marriage markets, and the interlocking credits and favors that underwrote colonial governance. A decision could restore faith in those channels, or at least display enough authority to make the colony bow its head. The men were interrogated under conditions designed to produce compliance. The colonial judiciary relied on a mix of canonical procedure and local improvisation. Priests and notaries recorded statements, but their records were inflected by the priorities of those who commissioned them. The difference between a confession and a coerced recantation could be the weight of a rope, the hunger of a cell, or the promise that a word might mean less punishment. The archive that remains is uneven: minutes, a few marginal notes, a handful of later recollections. Historians have had to read silence as a document in itself. Damião appeared at the tribunal as a man whose hands had always been his testimony. He answered in brief sentences when asked about practical details, when he had repaired the shutter, whether he had been alone, yet his eyes often travelled to the wooden bench where he had once sat to plane a rail. He refused to couch his life in pleas that would flatter a court. Where forced promises might have been currency for survival, Damião's gestures carried a steadier rhythm, naming the material facts he could not deny, and closing his mouth on what his accusers wanted as spectacle. Whether this was defiance, fatigue, or a refusal to be used by the court is indefinido. João Benguela's interrogation layered different languages and registers. When asked about the nature of his visits to the Casa Grande, he described leaving poultices and balancing bowls of tea on his knees. He described songs his mother taught him for wound binding. At points, he spoke in a phrase that the clerks noted as in the mother's tongue, an utterance they could not or would not translate. Such invocations unsettled the tribunal. They hinted at a cosmology the court was trained to nullify. At times, Benguela's answers seemed to verge on ritual, not defiance, but a refusal to render intimate practices into the syntax of legal confession. Miguel's interrogation contained the particular danger literacy imposed upon a man who had been taught letters in a world that punished their illicit use. The court held up his handwriting like a mirror. He wrote documents under compulsion, copied signatures, and at one stage produced a short note that the notary preserved. That note, later catalogued as a surviving note, reconstructed, fell into the archive as both evidence and a fragment of intimacy. Surviving note, reconstructed. Lady, the lamp you leave burns like a small harbour. I carry the words you name in my pocket. If they ask, tell them the wind did it. I fear the rope. Forgive if I have none of the right words. The phrasing, as preserved, is patchy and dependent upon later reconstructions. The exact wording is indefinido, but its archival afterlife mattered. The court read ink as motive. The family read ink as betrayal. The public read ink as drama. The paradox the tribunal navigated, or exploited, was theological and juridical at once. The law of the colony had long insisted that enslaved people were property. Canon law, too, recognized hierarchies of status that hardened into legal presumptions. Yet when a moral breach served the political ends of discipline, the same system could assign moral agency where it suited the spectacle. Thus the tribunal could indict enslaved men for seduction while never granting them the legal standing that would render such charges consistent. The prosecution's logic was a tightrope. To assert the men's culpability required the court to treat them as voluntary transgressors. To maintain the social economy it relied upon, it had to treat them as owned. The rhetorical sleight of hand was part of the discipline itself. Courtrooms are a theatre in more ways than one. The interrogations were conducted with a choreography meant to elicit more than truth. Confession, contrition, and the shaping of a story the public could understand. Witnesses were summoned: Teresa's earlier dealings, Damiana's delivery room testimony, servants who claimed to have seen doors closed at unusual hours. Each testimony bore the marks of pressure. Some statements were crisp, others tremulous. Testimony was also currency. Relatives of the Captain Moore, anxious for evidence that would restore honor, coached depositions. Servants, vulnerable to violence or promised clemency, weighed the words that might save them or mark them. There were moments in the record where human friction produced something like rupture. Damiana, the midwife whose knowledge had moved the scandal beyond rumor to fact, testified to seeing signs of pregnancy, an observation that converted an invisible series of acts into a visible index. The tribunal treated her as essential. the bearer of a corporeal truth that neither rumor nor letter could convey alone. Her testimony was delivered with the weary authority of someone who had held bodies through agony and birth, and had learned how the body speaks. Yet the tribunal's final acts were not simply about documentation. The court's decisions made choices about bodies and about memory. The verdicts issued were severe. The 3 men were condemned to die. An execution meant to do more than remove supposed transgressors. It was designed as moral pedagogy. The display would teach, in the most visceral terms, what transgression cost. The specificity of the sentence, method, timing, and even who would witness was calibrated to the colony's anxieties. For the family, the punishment was an attempt to excise the scandal. For the court, it was a public reaffirmation of order. The day of execution in Salvador was arranged with the same sense of ritual that had attended the tribunal. The square filled as word traveled down streets and alleyways. Merchants paused from their stands. Families folded into clusters, exchanging the small bets and whispered justifications that public spectacle invites. The scaffold rose like a punctuation mark against the whitewashed facades. Bells tolled, not for mourning but for summons. The city assembled to watch the law translate its sentence into a visible line. What the crowd saw was precise. The men led from the aljube, faces bound or uncovered depending on the decider's taste, the reading of the sentence. The final prayers offered in a language some understood, in another tongue that only a few recognized. The executions were designed as a lesson. The bodies were left, arranged, displayed, sometimes exhibited afterwards, so that the scaffolding of social compliance could be seen. People took hooves of wood and bits of rope as talismans. Others wrote down names in private notebooks. The spectacle was not just about punishment. It was a rehearsal of hierarchy, a public pedagogy that said, transgress, and the machine will respond. The precise personal last words of each man are not preserved in full. What survives are fragments, marginal notes by a notary, a later recollection by a sympathetic servant, a half-burned scrap rescued and later called into evidence. These surviving fragments, when stitched carefully, offer a chorus that complicates the state's narrative. Surviving fragment reconstructed. I did not learn the priest's book for such ends. My mother had a song for when men leave. It is in my mouth now. If they want to write my guilt, let them. I have a name that is not for the judge. Surviving fragment reconstructed. When they read my sin, I thought of the boat that took my father. I said a thing in the night that my mother taught. Call it prayer or call it curse. They could not mark it right. These lines, uneven, halting, traced through the filter of later scribes, are not to be taken as verbatim testimony. They are reconstructions, composites. But they illuminate a common feature: men who carried, in their bodies and words, languages that did not fit easily into the court's forms. While the executions fulfilled the state's pedagogical aims, their effects on San Jose were both immediate and corrosive. The sales notices went up. Creditors moved to collect. Land that had once been an asset became a liability when rumor had stiffened into record. The family's networks contracted. Marriage prospects cooled, alliances frayed, and trust in the regular cadence of payments evaporated like mist under sun. The economy that had once given the captain more his authority began to turn against him. The Casa Grande's rooms that once testified to a continual flow of hospitality now became evidence rooms, inspected, inventoried, and parceled out. Mariana's fate was a different kind of violence, erasure wrapped in piety. Rather than submit her to the public scaffold, those with social capital chose exile, an institutional solution that promised to remove the scandal from common sight while preserving the family from the worst of social ignominy. Mariana was sent to a convent. Records cite a house of recollection, where women of compromised status could be cloistered and transformed into cautionary tales rather than live recipients of public attention. The convent's walls promised containment, and for the family, a sanitized resolution that could be presented in parlor rooms as repentance. Inside the convent, Mariana's life was reshaped. Her days folded into ritual and routine. She was separated from the household whose rhythms had once given her both shelter and constraint. In religious enclosure, the possibility of authorship, of keeping a diary, of holding words meant for others, was paradoxically both more plausible and more dangerous. Papers that might betray more names were at risk. Some of her writings were destroyed, others were hidden and later recovered only in fragments. The process of curation, what was burned, what was kept, was itself a moral calculus enacted by those who feared contagion of scandal. Surviving fragment, reconstructed. I will write the days as if pulling teeth. The world that named me once now wants a different truth. If I must be small, I will still be a finger that finds the seam. Here again the voice is composite. The archive preserves, but pieces must be knit with cautious hands. Historians flag passages like this as suggestive, not definitive. The fact that some of Mariana's writings endured, partially burned, partially hidden, matters. It demonstrates that even when elites attempt to excise memory, the traces of interiority persist. The social calculus extended beyond individual fates to the macroeconomics of the Ingenio. San Jose, deprived both of labor and of trust, was parceled, mortgaged, and ultimately sold. The sale of land and the dispersal of enslaved labor were acts that reconfigured the region's labor map. Families who thought themselves insulated by rank found their capital reconstituted into the hands of others. The sugar economy, always precarious, had its own appetite for stories that undermined confidence in management. For creditors, the scandal had real consequences. A plantation in disarray threatened repayment and therefore led to legal remedies that scattered assets. Teresa's role in the unfolding chorus is ambiguous. The woman who had threatened to expose or to monetize a secret found herself in the glare of a process that could both empower and destroy. Some records suggest she received a measure of punishment. Others indicate she was used as a witness and then returned to the plantation world. Her bargaining had been an act of survival. Whether it ultimately benefited or damned her is indefinido. To treat her as a simple villain erases the horrific constraints within which such choices were made. The tribunal's aftermath extended into ritualized memory. Officials wrote reports, priests sermonized about the sin of seduction and the need for vigilance, and neighbors reframed the story into moral lessons. Yet underneath the official pronouncements were the persistent fragments that refused to fit neatly into the court's closed narrative. A half-burned sheet found under floorboards, a dried bouquet tucked into a Bible, the remembered song a mother had taught her son. These objects, small, stubborn, allowed future readers to reconstruct other stories. Over the years, historians returned to the case like archivists of discomfort. They read margins, followed the traces of ink, and resisted the temptation to smooth contradictions into a tidy moral. The reconstruction of what happened at San Jose is necessarily partial. There are lacunae where a clerk's pen never moved. There are testimonies recorded by men with vested interests. There are entire worlds, those of the enslaved, of the women behind shuttered windows, that the archive names only in absence. Yet even absences speak. The persistence of certain documents, Teresa's complaint, Damiana's statement, Miguel's note, the account books that show a sudden tightening of credit, creates a lattice that supports plausible narratives without resolving every question. One lesson of the San Jose affair is about the mechanisms of elite self-protection. When the colony's order felt threatened, the response was not inquiry but containment. The spectacle served to restore a visual hierarchy. The economy reasserted itself by redefining assets. The church performed a pedagogy of morals, even as it negotiated with creditors. The hypocrisy is visible in the retina of the records. Men who participated in the everyday violences of domination could call for the severest punishments when those same violences bled into the realm of public shame. Yet exposure is itself a complex instrument. The letters that moved from a servant's hand to the bishop's table did not simply wreak destruction. They revealed patterns the elite preferred to keep out of sight. For a moment, the public saw the contradictions in law and custom. The tribunal's theater could not efface the sense that the colony's moral grammar was brittle. Exposure forced at least a passing inventory of what the system permitted and how it punished. That inventory, however limited, created further room for memory and for resistance. In the centuries that followed, scholars have traced the San Jose case as a node through which many strands of colonial power pass: sexual domination, juridical contradiction, economic vulnerability, and the ways people under constraint attempted to claim some measure of agency. The archive's fragments, letters, notes, half-burned pages, the notary's scrawl, offer both evidence and provocation. They refuse total capture by the official narrative and demand that readers hold complexity, tenderness within coercion, complicity within survival, and the way social repertoires of honor can both protect elites and destroy lives. The moral impasse at the center of the case remains painful. A law that made people property while punishing them as moral agents. A church that preached chastity while living in the networks of families who transgressed. A society that performed honor as if it were impermeable. The São José scandal exposed these contradictions, but it did not correct them. The executions and the convent did not cleanse the system. They refined its rituals of discipline. There is also the question of memory and recovery. The fragments that survived, Mariana's torn pages, Miguel's reconstructed note, Damiana's testimony, have become touchstones for historians who refuse to let official records be the only record. They are the residue of resistance, small acts of concealment that later become the raw material of study. Recovering these scraps demands ethical attention. To treat them as testimony requires acknowledging their incompleteness and the violence that produced their partial survival. What do we make today of a scandal that involved sex, power, and the law in an economy that treated people as commodities? The easy answers reveal more about contemporary politics than about the historical reality. The harder work is to situate the events within the logic of their time and to allow the voices that the archive muffled to register, however faintly. To do so is to accept a double witness, the official registers that expose the elite's theatrical remedies and the fragments that reveal the human lives that the remedies could not wholly erase. In the final accounting, the São José affair reads as both an exposure and a concealment. It exposed the elite's dependence on silence and spectacle, their capacity to use law for preservation and violence for correction. It also attempted to conceal by executing selected bodies and by cloistering a woman whose presence threatened the social ledger. Yet the attempt was imperfect. Fragments survived. Those fragments are not full stories, but they mean that the official lesson was never complete. Memory pushed back through small objects and odd survivals. If the colony sought to teach a clear lesson about honor and punishment, it failed in at least one measure. It left behind clues that would trouble the neat moral. The evidence insists upon complexity. It insists that we see how exploitation creates the very intimacies it then polices, that coercion shapes consent in ways the law cannot easily adjudicate, that institutions that claim moral authority can be complicit in the violences they publicly denounce. We end where the bishop's candle once guttered, and the packet of letters began its journey. The São José story remains a mirror and an indictment. It asks of us to look and to reckon, not through the thin lens of scandal-mongering, but through careful attention to how systems of power use law, ritual, and violence to order lives. The men who were executed, the woman who was exiled, the family that fell into ruin, and the servants who preserved furtive notes are all part of a ledger that refuses a single moral acclamation. If you found this account compelling and want to explore the primary documents and reconstructions that shape this telling, share this video and check the description for annotated sources and links to archival materials. Leave a comment with questions or insights. These fragments continue to speak when we listen carefully.